Hi there, welcome to another online sociology lesson. We are looking today at reasons for criminal behaviour. Now, this is going back to that age-old question which we've been answering, well, since the beginning of our sociology course. Are people's behaviours a result of their upbringing and their nurture, or are we born with the behaviours which we display, like our nature? So we're going to that nature-nurture debate and we're going to apply it to the topic of crime. What makes a criminal? Is a criminal born a criminal? Can you look at a 6-month-old baby or a 2-year-old child and say that they were born with certain traits that will one day lead them to commit a crime? Or are human beings blank canvases and are solely products of their upbringing, which therefore leads them to commit crimes? And is it entirely a nature debate, so a nurture debate? We're going to look at both arguments. And of course, because it is sociology, we are going to apply this to our kind of sociological understandings in a couple of lessons' time. Okay, so today we are going to look much more at the kind of psychological effects of crime and the psychological factors of crime. And then next lesson and lessons going forwards, we will look at the sociological arguments in a lot more depth. But first, just make sure that you are up to date with your nature-nurture key terms. So one more time before we go forwards, nature is your biology, it is your genetics, it is your DNA, it is the person you were born as, and nurture is the way you were brought up. So your primary socialization and your secondary socialization. That is the definition of both of those terms. And I've just got that explained for you there on this very nice slide, which I definitely didn't create myself. I definitely got off Google. So it's your nature is your genes and your hereditary factors that you get from your parents. So kind of the DNA that's been passed down through your parents, how you look. And in some cases, we could also argue your personality characteristics. If you are sort of person who displays similar traits to your parents, that might be a nature thing. On the flip side, nurture is all about your environment. We say your environment in sociology, we mean your human environment rather than necessarily your kind of trees and field and stuff, although that does have an impact. The things you experienced as a child, the sort of ways that you were raised, i.e. the norms and values of your childhood, what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable, and your social relationships and surrounding culture. The best example we have at the moment that we've used of the nurture argument is Oksana Malaya. Remember the girl that was raised by wolves? She was adopted, kind of not properly adopted, but she was taken, under the wing of wolves, aged very, very young, and she grew up to bark and walk like a wolf and walk like a dog and kind of drink water in the same way that a wolf and a dog would. And she was very much a product of her upbringing rather than necessarily being a product of her biology. And we're going to take this argument and we're going to apply it to crime. So what makes a criminal? So to start with, we're going to look at the genetic factors, and this is the argument that criminals have certain genes which make them criminals. Okay, criminals have basically crime written into their DNA, and they're almost destined to commit crime. They're destined to be a criminal. Okay, so if you can make this subtitle Nature Genetic Factors, you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to do too much of the talking. Okay, I'm going to leave this over to those who know a lot better than I do. So I'm going to break this down into a basic understanding, and then I'm going to show you a video which you are going to watch and hopefully will help you understand this a little bit better. I'm going to attach some questions as well which you can answer as you watch this video. So to start with, scientists have discovered that there are 2 genes which are more likely to exist in the most violent of criminals. And that's not saying that every single person who has this gene is a criminal, and it's also not saying that every single violent criminal has this gene. All they're saying is they did a study of hundreds of criminals, and the most violent ones did have these genes, and they found that those who had these genes, so these criminals, were 13 times more likely to have a history of repeated violent behaviour before before they got arrested. Okay, so they were arrested for violent behavior, but these guys had a history throughout their lives of violent behavior, and they were 13 times more likely to have that history than those who didn't have this gene and weren't in this category. Okay, so there might be some kind of argument that there are certain genes which make people more violent, make people more aggressive, and maybe make people more likely to commit certain types of crime. Okay, so the way that genes work, and this is going to be obviously quite a brief explanation of genes from someone who's not a genetic scientist, so I hope I don't say something glaringly wrong. When you are born, biologically male or biologically female, okay, we're not thinking about gender here, we're just thinking about sort of biological sex. Females have what is called XX genes and males have what is called XY genes. The specific gene which scientists found in violent criminals, so that gene which we were suggesting maybe could lead somebody to performing actions which were more violent, is passed by the mother to their child down the X line. Okay, so this kind of, if we're gonna call it this, the crime gene is passed down the X line rather than the Y line. Now that means the following: if this particular gene is passed down to a female, so the red line indicates the sort of crime gene, then she also has another line of X genes, which could be good ones, so-called, which then would balance out the bad one. Okay, so it is, you see far less commonly female violent criminals, and this could be one of the reasons why. If this supposed criminal gene is passed down the X line to a male, then he has no other X lines which could be like good lines to counteract the criminal one. So you might then see a male who has had the X gene passed down, the kind of criminal gene passed down, that comes out in more violent behavior, okay, because there is no opposite gene to counteract it passed down that same X line. Okay, so females are less likely statistically to be violent criminals, and you see this just even at school, the amount of punch-ups you see between boys compared to the amount of punch-ups you see between girls. Males generally are more likely to display aggressive, violent behavior than females. Now, we will also look at the sociological reasons behind that. So a lot of feminists would argue there's different reasons as to why women are more kind of placid than males who tend to be more aggressive. But this is one of the genetic arguments. So you might use this to say that actually violent crime in men is a genetic reason rather than a sociological one. Okay, because men might be getting this violent criminal gene passed down to them. To explain this a bit better, I'm going to show you a video of a scientist who actually knows what she's talking about, okay, which makes a great change from me. Okay, so your next subtitle is Nature Psychological Factors. Now, what I mean by psychological factors is factors of the brain. Okay, so the way that someone's brain is developed, the activity within that brain, we found differences between the brain patterns of criminals and the brain patterns of law-abiding citizens. Okay, and again, it's one of those things where it's not like a one-size-fits-all argument, so you can't say every single criminal has got this brain pattern, or everyone who's got this brain pattern is going to be a criminal. But there are patterns which we can see, there are trends which we can see emerging, which maybe point us in a bit more of an understanding as to maybe what makes a criminal. So you can see this picture on the screen here. It has the brain activity of what they've called a normal person. Now, what the only reason they use the word normal is to distinguish that brain from that of the psychopath. Okay, somebody who displays psychopathic tendencies. Now, psychopathic tendencies are tendencies and sort of behavior patterns where somebody maybe can't register empathy. So psychopaths find it very, very difficult to feel sorry for other people, or to feel the pain that other people are going through, which you can obviously see as a big factor in a serial killer. It doesn't really work if you're a serial killer who feels sorry for your victims. That doesn't really work. Similarly, psychopaths have real trouble recognizing emotions in others. Again, a massive stumbling block if you are a serial killer. If you realise that the person that you're hurting is in pain, that's you know, it's kind of common traits in serial killers to not be able to recognise emotions and not be able to display empathy or feel the pain that others are feeling. So that's what this kind of picture is showing, that the brain on the left has far more empathetic and emotional intelligence kind of activity compared to the one on the right. And what we've found by this is that these brains, again, as I said, kind of are more likely to occur in people who commit some of the most violent crimes. Now, we're not saying that all people with these brain patterns commit crimes, but there is links going on. And that third bullet point on the screen here is really important. These abnormalities, these development issues, because often it's brains which in some ways are underdeveloped. The emotional intelligence part of the brain hasn't developed properly. These abnormalities might exist from birth, i.e. there was development issues in the womb which led a child to be born that way, or it could result as a result of a brain injury. So often if something is dropped onto the head of a child in the kind of development stage, then that can really stunt the development of the orbital cortex, which is the front of the brain, which is where you kind of register emotion and empathy. That might not develop properly, or childhood trauma. So a lot of the time in kind of the most extreme examples of serial killers, they are very commonly people who experienced real traumatic events as a child, which can have real long-lasting effects on their brain and their psychological makeup. Okay, so in summary and in short, there are, again, similar to the genetic factors, there are traits, not rules, not kind of one size fits all, but common traits that people who commit some of the most violent crimes, for example serial killers, do have brain abnormalities which mean that they don't feel empathy and they find it hard to recognize the emotions of other people, which can then lead them to being more able to commit horrible criminal acts. Okay, and again, I'm going to put this over to someone who knows a lot more what they're talking about, and I'm going to show you a little bit of this video. Now, it's really important to mention that those sort of brain abnormalities mentioned on that video are not the only psychological reasons for crime. Okay, it's not to say that everyone who commits a crime has those brain abnormalities, or it's also incorrect to say that all psychological reasons for crime are an issue to do with brain development. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that there are other psychological reasons for crime that are a bit more short term. So like not having development of your brain is a very long term issue, right? Short term issues which could also cause crime are things like postnatal depression. So a lot of women, and more so than I think we've ever realized, because it's always been a bit of a taboo in society, a bit of a thing that's not really talked about, but more and more women are kind of revealing that after the birth of a child, they suffer from what's known as postnatal depression. And this kind of issue, this mental illness, for want of a better word, has been known to cause mothers to commit crimes against their own children. Okay, and a lot of the time, in cases such as these, the court will rule what's called diminished responsibility. So that means that the woman who committed a crime against her own child cannot be held fully responsible for that crime, because she was in a psychological state of mind which meant that she was out of control, out of her normal self. Okay, and that's what diminished responsibility means. Other mental illnesses which can be long-term but also can be shorter term, such as schizophrenia, psychosis and bipolar disorder, can also cause people to commit criminal acts if for whatever reason they are, again, out of control or have diminished responsibility. Okay, so psychological reasons for crime range from very, very long-term ones that affect people from birth, and then other shorter-term psychological illnesses which might cause crime in the short term. Okay, and both of those are psychological factors. Obviously, these ones here are a kind of weird combination of nature and nurture, because it happens to someone in their life and life events have caused it, but it's also to do with their own personal disposition. Okay, right, moving forwards, we can conclude that crime is the result of both nature and nurture. It's really unwise to say that crime is simply a nature thing. So we can't really say, there's no evidence to suggest that people are born criminals, but we can certainly say that people are born with certain characteristics or certain behavioural patterns, which, if brought up in a certain way, could lead them towards committing crimes. Okay, so the one kind of behavioural trait that was common both in the men who had the genetic factor, those two genes that was prevalent in all of those violent men, and the brain patterns of the psychopaths that we looked at in the previous video, the one thing that both of them struggled with was controlling their impulses. Lack of impulse control, be it because of genetics or because of psychological factors, lack of genetic control, which both of them were kind of a prevalent factor, can be a huge part in somebody's prevalence of being a criminal or committing crime, because we all have impulses, all of us do. If somebody annoys us, if we get into an argument with a friend, the impulse might be, I really want them to hurt, I want them to suffer because I'm angry at them. It's an angry impulse. But we don't all just go around knocking our friends out or getting hitmen to come and take them out. You know, that's not what happens, because most people can control their impulses, and most people know that the impulse they're having is wrong. The issue is when somebody has those impulses and can't control them in the first place, and they are brought up or in a social environment where those lack of impulses are not addressed, or the lack of impulses are not challenged, that's when it could lead to crime. Okay, because we all have impulses, but a lot of us know how to control them, and if we don't know how to control them, we often have someone teaching us that that's wrong, but not everyone has that. Okay, so this is where people who engage in criminal behaviour could be a factor of both nature and nurture. Now, of course, we're not saying that every single person who commits a crime is because of lack of impulses. We're not saying that just even slightly, but we are making that argument that actually there seems to be a lot of links, a lot of commonality between genetics, psychological factors, both of which talk about a lack of impulse control, and then social factors which also feed into it as well. Okay, in the next few lessons we are going to look at those social factors that may lead people towards crime. Now, this is kind of like a basic overview which I've given you, just a very kind of brief overview of the topic. We are not going to delve too much into this in future lessons, because we just kind of need to know that crime is a result of nature and nurture, and not just fall down the sociological trap of saying it's all nurture. Okay, so this lesson is for us to understand that there is definitely brain activity and genetic makeups that lead to crime. But if you want to do more research in your own time, you are most welcome to do that. I know it's a really interesting topic, and the whole argument of what makes a criminal is very, very interesting. So because I thought a lot of you would want to do some extra research, this is not compulsory, but if you wanted to, I'm going to show you just some further bits that you could read and watch and research yourself to find out a little bit more about this topic. So if you want to take it further, I'd suggest you start off by looking at this excellent TED Talk by a lady called Liz Shilling, and it's on YouTube. You just type in nature versus nurture, what makes a serial murderer, and you will find her video. It's about 9 minutes long and it's really, really helpful. You can also look at some of these cases. So a man called Tony Mobley, his lawyers, after he was convicted of multiple violent crimes and murders, his lawyers argued that he was born to kill. He was born with a genetic disposition that made him into a criminal. So again, he kind of wasn't at fault according to his lawyers. And a lady called Erin Sutherland, who suffered from postnatal depression and unfortunately killed her own child as a result of this. So her sentence was massively reduced as a result of the fact that she was suffering from a psychological illness at the time. There are also theories that you could research. There's a guy called Cesar Lombroso. Now his theory is no longer accepted as science. It's a very, very long time ago, but he basically reckoned that you could tell a criminal by the shape of their skull. Again, not really seen as true anymore, but still interesting to look at nonetheless. A guy called John Bowlby, who looked at what was called attachment theories. Is basically the attachment, the emotional attachment that you generate between child and mother, and he said that if a child is separated from their mother early on in their life, in the first few weeks of their life, then this could cause emotional damage, which could lead to criminal behaviour. So there's a lot of coulds and a lot of maybes, but he's kind of seen some links between attachment and crime. And also a guy called Sarnoff Mednick, is looking at adoption, and his argument is basically that we are far more products of nature than we realise. He looked at adopted children and he realised that they showed more behavioural traits of their biological parents, the ones that they'd never seen, than their adopted ones who brought them up. So he said that our nature actually overrides our nurture, and that's really interesting when looking at crime and seeing how that all links in together. Okay, so if you wanted to look at any further, you could, but the kind of the basic tasks are also plenty enough for this lesson. Thanks very much. Have a good day.